A lot of people are saying this new game, BioShock Infinite, has some ludonarrative dissonance because throughout the game you're doing socially progressive things. You're smart and helpful. There's quantum physics. There's freeing the races that are oppressed by the other races. There's some relationships stuff with a woman, but it's not romantic. It's just, personal. But that's during the cutscenes. During all the not cutscenes, you're just making a psychic flock of ravens shoot out of your hands and eat a robot man and other things. A lot of shooting, killing. Shooting, killing.
How's that different from other games?
Well, I guess how it's different from other games is that this game really does try to make smart things happen during the cutscenes. In this, it's like you're hanging around with a smart college professor-y type science fiction friend guy during the cutscenes, and then you're just hanging around with like an NRA, blow him up, shoot him in the face, except with psychic powers guy during the gameplay. And there's what they call a dissonance there. So, how does that make you feel? Do you want to play this game?
I don't want to play that game.
Would you want to play it if there wasn't any violence? If it was just like smart, socially progressive sci-fi fun times like Doctor Who?
No.
BioShock Infinite is a game about violence. It's not just a violent game. It's a game that has one central theme that is violence. That's what it is. Now, yes, Columbia's this beautiful city. Yes, the relationship between Booker and Elizabeth is beautiful in its own right. It's compelling, it's endearing, it's wonderfully written. But the violence doesn't undermine that, because if you're looking at the beauty of Columbia and the interesting relationship between Booker and Elizabeth, and you think the violence undermines that, well, you might think you're being intelligent by saying that, but you're actually kind of betraying your own vapid point of view, if I'm to be perfectly blunt, because the violence is an undercurrent of the whole thing. Booker DeWitt is a violent man. He's fighting violent people. Elizabeth is a victim of violence through and through. To me, one of the central premises of the game is, no matter how beautiful something is, no matter how gorgeously designed a city, no matter how elegantly dressed the people, there can always be this undercurrent of inherent, deep-seated ugliness. And that, in BioShock Infinite, speaks to me. And I think the violence is important. And I think it's ironic that BioShock Infinite does more to justify its violence than most games.
The violence is really distracting. Like, I can't get around that. Early in the game, you take a spin rotor blade thing to somebody's face and cut it in half. Like, that's completely excessive and totally unnecessary. I think there's a lot more combat than there really needs to be. There's several different sections where there's a really strong narrative segment, and I really wanted to get to, like, the next big thing, the next big aspect of the story, so I could keep going. And that tension was broken up by me being forced to fight waves of dudes that I just didn't care about, had nothing to do with anything, and had no real purpose at all. There are some very, very interesting parts of it where fighting people is fun, and I don't really have any problem with that. But it just seems to be kind of like a cheap sort of thing to pad out gameplay and make it more along the lines of most other AAA games. I think the absolute best parts of BioShock Infinite were the parts where you're just wandering around Columbia, talking to Elizabeth and seeing the interesting things, watching her face light up as she sees stuff that she's read about. Those kinds of moments were the most affecting and were the most, I think, unique. And I think that's where BioShock Infinite shines.
I'm pretty conflicted on that one. On one hand, Infinite did more right than a lot of games that I've ever seen. Has one of the strongest narratives. The world was absolutely beautiful. So to see it fall back on the same old gameplay mechanics that are kind of, tried and true to speak. Would it really be a BioShock game if it weren't this violent? It's right in the same vein as BioShock 1, BioShock 2, System Shock 2, all of that. So to ask for there to be less violence, I don't know if you're really asking for the same franchise of games. I did find the violence to be distracting at some points, but at the same time there's a lot going on that's distracting in Infinite. So I think the violence took away from how great the game could have been, but I also think it might have been kind of necessary.
It's hard to talk about why the violence is the way it is in BioShock Infinite without talking about specific story beats. There are reasons behind Booker DeWitt, the character you control's, his behaviour and his attitude towards violence. The violence is there to be condemned. It's not there to be gratuitous, even though the images and the things you are doing in the game can sometimes be shocking, and there were times where I looked at the game and was just taken aback sometimes. It's never celebratory. It's not there to be glorified. I believe that the violence is the way it is to make you feel uncomfortable, and there are reasons that are explained towards the end of the story where it makes sense.
It's not about you as the player, it's about Booker as a character. And for me, what the violence does is it serves to show, like, hey, here's this guy who's kind of a murderous psychopath, and it disconnects me from him because I wouldn't do a lot of the things that he does. And that's important because once it set out that disconnect at the very beginning, it could then later go and take the story in certain directions where Booker's not doing things that I would have done in that situation. And that's okay with me because I'm not Booker, he's not me. I'm controlling his actions, I'm not controlling his mind, I'm not controlling his decisions. I'm sort of just watching this story play out, but taking a part in making that story happen.
So I'm not really sure why people are singling out BioShock Infinite as this game that might be too violent when we're constantly inundated with incredibly violent games. I think it's maybe just because the juxtaposition of these peaceful, serene moments and the moments of extreme violence are things that some people aren't necessarily used to. But I don't think that makes it too violent, and I don't think that means that the game should have been different. And people saying that it would have been better without that violence, I think have missed some of the messages of the game, where it's condemning the violence it's showing. And you can't condemn something if you're not going to show the negative outcome of the thing you're condemning. And the game is littered with moments where you see the effect you've had because of the violence, not just in the way that Elizabeth reacts to you, but in other moments that I wouldn't want to spoil for anyone who hasn't actually played the game.
I don't necessarily think they're too violent. I think they demonstrate the most violent periods of their setting's history, which of course seems to be their declines, but violence is sort of core to the gameplay, it's core to the setting, it's core to the personality, the culture that you visit as a character. You could say that there is something kind of interesting about Infinite in that it offers you the execution move, and I think that that's kind of fascinating because if there, this is an animation that is probably the most directly violent kind of thing that the player can initiate, but it's entirely optional. It's player initiated. The game just says press X to execute, and you can do that. It doesn't tell you have to do it. It doesn't necessarily make you do it more than, I think, once for demonstration purposes at the very beginning of the game. And so you have kind of this pressure valve on whether or not you want it to be that violent. If you want to be over the top and gory, you can hold that X button a little bit longer and do your execution kill instead of just a basic melee whack. And I find that kind of interesting, that the opportunity to choose how violent you want to be kind of exists a little bit in Infinite.